Dropouts sleep outside. As I stood at the front desk of the luxury inn, struggling to make sense of the situation, Miles, my boss, sneered and said something completely absurd. Even though summer was just around the corner, it was still cold outside because the inn was nestled in the mountains. A sense of dread washed over me as I started to feel like my future was slipping away. I had a bad feeling ever since Miles volunteered to organize this company trip. But I might have let my guard down, thinking that since I was the one who made the reservation, everything would be fine. Upon arriving at the inn, I went to confirm our reservation at the front desk, only to find that all the bookings I had made under my name had somehow been cancelled. While I panicked and tried to figure out what went wrong, Miles calmly pushed me aside and completed the check-in process for everyone. It was at that moment I realized my bad feeling had come true. Miles handed out room keys to everyone, but when it came to my turn, he claimed there wasn't a room for me. Without even a hint of worry, Miles exaggeratedly pretended to have forgotten my room. However, little did he know that this stunt would backfire on him. When he discovered who I truly was, Miles was speechless with shock, but I was even more stunned by who he really was. My name is David Wilson, and I'm 42 years old. When I was young, my parents divorced, and I was raised by my grandparents at my father's family home. Though we moved from the city to a rural area, I never felt deprived. However, many classmates looked down on me because of my unique living situation, and I never quite fit in at my new school. Even in high school, nothing changed, and the judgmental stares from others made me skip school frequently. But my grandparents never said a word of complaint, they were always kind and supportive. I still remember how they stood by me when I decided to drop out of high school. They've both passed away now. But at 42, I'm surrounded by my new family, and we live a happy life together. Of course, I plan to give my children the same love my grandparents gave me. No matter what happens, I will watch over them with warmth and understanding. When I dropped out of high school, I didn't want to burden my grandparents, so I started working part-time at construction sites. After a few years of working, I caught the eye of Mr. Michael Yates, the president of the contracting company. And he offered me a full-time position. I can never thank him enough for giving a high school dropout like me a chance. As a salesperson, I successfully closed many deals and was eventually promoted to sales manager. Recently, there were even rumors that I might be promoted to department head. However, in line with Mr. Yates's vision of bringing fresh perspectives into the company, they decided to hire an outside candidate for the position. I had high hopes, trusting Mr. Yates's judgment, but the person who showed up was beyond anything I expected. I'm Miles, your new department head starting today. You lowlifes should feel lucky I'm even allowing you to work for me. The new department head, Miles, had been recruited from a major manufacturer as a career hire. From the very first impression, his strong personality and intimidating demeanor left everyone uneasy during his introduction. Mr. Yates had mentioned that Miles was a highly skilled sales manager at his previous job. Even if that were true, his attitude of looking down on us and treating us like disposable tools caused immediate resentment within the department. As a manager, I tried to talk to Miles, hoping to create a better work environment for the team. Miles, we have many talented employees here. Could you please acknowledge that and treat them with the respect they deserve? You should be grateful to be working under me. None of that matters. By the way, where did you go to college? He brushed off my concerns and suddenly hit me with a question I wasn't expecting. Unsure but honest, I answered. I dropped out of high school. Hearing that, Miles let out a slight snort, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. Well, that explains why you talk about such insignificant things. Low education means low value. Miles, who placed great importance on academic credentials, would proudly boast about having graduated from a prestigious university, completely dismissing anything I had to say. After enduring his endless bragging, I was eventually kicked out of his office as though I were a nuisance. From the next day on, my new nickname became the Dropout. Miles seemed to find pleasure in mocking my lack of education. even publicly ridiculing me in meetings attended by all department managers and above. Until Miles showed up, no one at the company had ever judged me based on my education. Everyone evaluated me based on my work ethic and results. That's why, despite my background, I was able to focus on my job, and even now, there are far more people in the company rooting for me than for Miles. Jealous of my growing success, Miles began to find amusement in harassing me. He shoved all the tedious, time-consuming tasks onto me, and before I knew it, my desk was buried under an ever-growing pile of paperwork. The stack of documents on my desk was so high it looked like it could collapse at any moment. You're supposed to be competent, right? A high school dropout should at least be able to handle these easy tasks, don't you think? On top of that, Miles even dumped his own work on me, which left me with no time for my actual responsibilities, causing me to make simple mistakes, like missing deadlines. See? A dropout can't even handle the easy stuff. With a smug grin, Miles would throw in snide comments and head out of the office right on time, leaving me to work late into the night. It wasn't unusual for me to get home after midnight due to all the overtime. Exhausted and sleep-deprived, I was starting to become mentally unstable. Miles always acted arrogantly in front of me. However, I often caught him sucking up to the higher-ups and executives, and each time, it seemed like he was spreading rumors that I was incompetent. I figured that denying the rumors would just sound like excuses, so I focused on proving myself through my work. After a few weeks, the harassment stopped, and I could finally handle my workload without issues. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was the calm before the storm, and sure enough, I soon heard that Miles was in charge of this year's company trip. It seemed he had volunteered in an attempt to curry favor with the executives. A few days later, when he still hadn't come up with a travel plan, Miles suddenly demanded that we, the employees, come up with ideas. His unreasonable order left the entire department silent. Frustrated, Miles began shouting angrily, "Doesn't anyone know of a good place? What a bunch of useless, low-educated idiots!" His temper worsened by the day, and soon, his frustration was directed squarely at me. "Hey, drop out. You've had an easy life with nothing to do, so surely you know of a nice place, right? Well, I'm not good at anything besides work." Miles clicked his tongue loudly and stormed off, his footsteps heavy. Although I had a suggestion in mind, I hesitated, worried that it might cause trouble for the inn, so I kept quiet. As the days passed and Miles still couldn't make a decision, his mood grew even darker. "If we're going on a company trip, I know a luxury inn in the neighboring prefecture that offers good rates, but I'm not keen on recommending it." One day, while I was muttering to myself in the break room, Miles suddenly appeared out of nowhere and spoke up. "The luxury inn you mentioned, are you talking about this one?" He waved a brochure for the inn in front of me, his grin widening as he stepped closer. "If you've got connections to get a good rate at this inn, then you'd better make the reservation." The inn Miles referred to was indeed the one I didn't want to recommend. But the budget we had wouldn't cover accommodations for everyone, no matter how I crunched the numbers. There was a way to make it work within the budget, but I worried that Miles's behavior might cause problems for the inn. I tried to act like I'd forgotten, but Miles pestered me daily to make the reservation. "Hey! You made the reservation, right?" Worn down by Miles's persistence, I reluctantly made the reservation for the whole group. "Yes. I've made the reservation. I also received the cost estimate and some guidelines from the inn, so please review them." I handed him the documents from the inn, and Miles snatched them from me with a sly grin. I wasn't sure what he was planning, but since I had made the reservation myself, I figured it would be fine. Miles quickly started organizing the trip, but as he left, I had a feeling he was smirking at me. When I turned around, I caught Miles giving me a sideways glance, shooing me away like I was a nuisance. A cold chill ran down my spine, and an unsettling sense of fear gripped me. I couldn't stop shaking. On the day of the trip, Miles was confidently taking charge from the start. However, the sightseeing spots he had chosen were unimpressive, and the reactions from the group were lukewarm at best. Sensing the underwhelming mood, Miles suddenly pinned the blame on me. We went to the places suggested by a dropout, and they were all mediocre and half-baked. Frustration building, Miles went out of his way to paint me as the bad guy. I knew it, never listened to a dropout's advice. But don't worry, everyone, I chose the inn, so you're in good hands with that. That's not true. Miles picked the sightseeing spots, but I had arranged the inn. Complaining wouldn't do any good. As I kept silent, cold stares were directed at me. When we arrived at the inn and I tried to check in, I was told there was no reservation under my name. The receptionist, clearly flustered, double-checked the booking ledger, only to find that all the reservations I had made had been cancelled. As I frantically kept asking for confirmation, Miles stepped in with a smug smile and shoved me aside. The reservation is under Miles. The receptionist, relieved that Miles's name was on the reservation, processed it, but something still felt off. Miles then began handing out room keys to everyone, but one key was missing. This isn't everyone, right? Where's my room? When I asked, confused, Miles smirked and mockingly feigned pity. Oh, right. Sorry about that, but I forgot to reserve a room for the high school dropout. What? What do you mean? When I checked with the receptionist, it turned out that the reservation had been changed a week ago just in time to avoid any cancellation fees. Apparently, after I had secured the reservation, Miles had rebooked it under his name and deliberately reduced the number of rooms. If I don't have a room, what am I supposed to do? Though summer was approaching, the mountain air around the inn was still cold. As I panicked, Miles placed a hand on my shoulder and said something nonsensical, clearly mocking me. Dropouts sleep outside. It suits your low education, doesn't it? The reception staff were also visibly alarmed by Miles's bizarre behavior. But, given that this was a popular luxury inn, it was already fully booked. There was no way to free up another room at the last minute. My shoulders slumped, and a sense of hopelessness washed over me. The receptionist, now pale and panicking, scrambled to handle the sudden situation. However, I couldn't shake the bad feeling I had, as I had suspected that something like this might happen all along. Completely fed up with Miles's scheming, I took a deep breath and began to gather my belongings. Understood. But don't regret this later. Huh? What's there to regret about one dropout not staying with us? Miles grinned smugly. Without another word, I turned my back on him and calmly walked out of the inn. The next morning, after enjoying a peaceful night elsewhere, I was awakened by the ringing of my phone. The call cut off just as I was about to answer, but when I checked my phone, I was shocked to see 100 missed calls from Miles. I must have slept deeply after the exhausting events of the previous day. Curious, I called him back, only to hear Miles's frantic, relieved voice. Finally! I got through. Now we can fix this. All of Miles's usual arrogance was gone. Still half asleep, I casually asked what the issue was. What's the matter this early in the morning? What do you mean, what's the matter? You must have done something. Take responsibility. Miles was furious, shouting accusations, but I remained calm. I told you yesterday not to regret it. My response only seemed to enrage Miles further, his voice rising again. So you did do something. You've ruined my perfect plan. What are you going to do about it? I didn't do anything. That can't be. Now my reputation is ruined. Apparently, Miles's so-called perfect plan had completely unraveled, and he and the other employees had endured a terrible night. First, the luxury inn's highly anticipated gourmet dinner never arrived, and everyone had to buy their own food from a nearby convenience store. Meanwhile, I had spent a relaxing night at a nearby hot spring facility. Miles had been trying to call me all night, but I slept through it, unaware of the chaos. That explained all the missed calls. To make matters worse, the breakfast buffet, which was supposed to feature local delicacies, wasn't served either. And Miles was being blamed for everything. Frustrated that I hadn't answered any of his calls, Miles had kept calling until morning, finally getting through to me. Miles kept blaming me relentlessly, refusing to listen to a word I said. Once he had exhausted himself with complaints, I calmly explained the details I had already provided along with the estimate. I believe the note I gave you mentioned that if the reservation was made under a name other than mine, the standard rates would apply. What? That paper, oh, that one. But who actually reads that stuff? I did remind you to go over it carefully, didn't I? The reservation had been made at a special discount through my connections. However, it was clearly stated that if the booking was made under a different name, the budget would only cover basic accommodations without meals. Despite this, Miles, still refusing to accept the situation, kept blaming me, but nothing about the situation was going to change. Through the phone, I could hear Miles's raised voice, along with the sound of executives and employees berating him in the background. At some point, I even heard Miles, with no choice left, apologizing profusely, bowing his head to those around him. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Just come here, right now. His voice trembling with panic, Miles hung up the phone before I could respond. When I reluctantly returned to the inn, I saw Miles sitting uncomfortably on his knees, surrounded by a crowd at the front desk. Good morning, sorry to keep you waiting. You. Why didn't you answer my calls? Where were you, and what were you doing last night? Miles suddenly jumped up from his kneeling position, but his legs had fallen asleep, and he immediately collapsed. Still, he glared at me with a furious expression, as if ready to pounce at any moment. The sight of Miles, pitiful and ridiculous, drew soft laughter from those around us. Blushing from embarrassment and clearly flustered, Miles grew more erratic. And I felt a bit sorry for him as I began explaining how I had spent the previous night. I stayed at a nearby campground. A campground? Where the hell is that? It's about a 20-minute walk from here. There's a hot spring nearby, and you can rent camping gear, so you don't need to bring anything. Intrigued by the unexpected answer, some of the employees gathered around me, and the conversation shifted to the campground, creating a bit of excitement. But Miles wasn't having it. That's not the point. Why wasn't there any food served? You must have sabotaged everything out of jealousy because I'm more educated than you. Miles's angry shouts echoed through the lobby. Just then, the inn's manager, dressed impeccably in a suit, approached with a look of exasperation on her face. I'm Emma, the owner of this inn. Miles, was it? You can't speak like that to the owner of the inn. The owner? Who? Miles was dumbfounded by her words. With a sigh, Emma stepped aside, allowing me to speak. I am the owner of this inn. What? How? What are you talking about? This makes no sense. Still yelling angrily, Miles refused to listen as usual. Having had enough, Emma snapped at him. Miles, we clearly informed you when you rebooked the reservation. We told you that with your budget, it would only cover accommodations without meals. You agreed to that. Miles, now pale and sweating profusely, muttered excuses while looking down at the floor. I remember something being said during the booking, but I didn't really understand it. So this isn't my fault, it's the inn's fault. At this point, Mr. Yates, who had been standing nearby with his arms crossed, finally spoke up, exasperated. I've heard enough. Cut it out, already. Mr. Yates. No, you see, this is all a misunderstanding. It's not my fault. Miles frantically tried to justify himself to Mr. Yates, but his desperate excuses only made Mr. Yates sigh heavily and shake his head. I began to suspect how poorly thought out Miles's plans were during yesterday's sightseeing. But I never imagined he was this careless. Mr. Yates then bowed deeply to Emma to apologize, before turning to glare coldly at Miles. Miles, meeting Mr. Yates's eyes, collapsed to the floor, curling up and crying like a child. Looking down at the pitiful Miles, I explained why I was the owner of the luxury inn. This inn was built on the mountain property my grandparents owned. For years, they had struggled with managing the land that had been passed down through generations. So I suggested building an inn at the location, which was already famous for its hot springs. My grandfather, a hot spring enthusiast, loved the idea and decided to open the inn as a retirement project, following my advice. Running the inn wasn't easy for my grandparents in their old age. That's when I decided to entrust Emma, an old acquaintance who had always cared for me like her own child, with the role of the inn's manager. After my grandparents passed away, I inherited the mountain property and, with it, became the owner of the luxury inn. Under Emma's skillful management, the inn's reputation steadily grew, and before long, it became a popular high-end destination. Even now, many guests from all over the country visit to enjoy the secluded hot springs and locally sourced cuisine. And it's become so popular that reservations are notoriously difficult to secure. By the way, the campground I mentioned earlier was something my grandfather started as a hobby. Growing up with the mountains as my playground, I would often escape to the campground whenever I had free time to enjoy some peace and solitude. Of course, the management is handled by acquaintances, so I don't have to get involved directly. I had only thought of the campsite as a backup plan, but I never imagined I'd actually be left out and have to use it. Despite repeatedly telling Miles to review the terms, he ignored them and dragged everyone into this mess. There was nothing left to say. When Miles finally realized that I was the owner of the inn, his jaw dropped in shock, eyes wide as he stared at me. After a few seconds of stunned silence, Miles's expression shifted, and suddenly, he lashed out at me. "This is all your fault. Everyone's upset, so you should fix this. Stop making it sound like I'm the only one to blame." His irrational outburst made everyone around him sigh heavily. Emma, clearly irritated, shot Miles an icy glare and spoke sharply. "You were the one who changed the reservation, weren't you? We were willing to give you a discount as a favor to Mr. Wilson here. I'm his boss. And we're not going to go out of our way to treat someone who disrespects Mr. Wilson with kindness." Miles, overwhelmed by Emma's sharp words, turned pale and began trembling in fear, falling silent. Seeing him reduced to a quivering mess, the employees couldn't hold back their laughter, pointing at Miles as they mocked him. Just then, a young woman who worked at the inn as a maid approached, looking surprised. "Dad? What are you doing here?" "Wait, Rachel, is this the troublesome dad you mentioned before?" The young woman who had called Miles dad was Rachel, a maid working at the inn. To my surprise, Rachel turned out to be Miles's daughter. Startled by this sudden revelation, Miles quickly straightened his posture and averted his gaze, pretending not to know her. "Dad? No, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not your father. You wouldn't want your daughter to see you in such an embarrassing situation, would you?" I muttered. At that, Miles suddenly stood up and rushed toward me, clearly agitated. "I told you, I'm not her father." "Miles, calm down," I said. His blatant behavior was becoming more and more uncomfortable to watch. Come to think of it, I suddenly remembered something. Ever since the company trip was first mentioned, Miles had been holding onto a brochure for this inn. Could it be that Miles had wanted to come here from the start just to see his daughter? That suspicion quickly turned into certainty. Could it be that you wanted to come here because your daughter works at this inn? Stop it. Don't say unnecessary things. And now that you mention it, you were unusually enthusiastic about this trip. Miles, now red-faced with embarrassment, desperately tried to shut me up, but his efforts were clumsy and ineffective. Mr. Yates, who had been silently observing Miles's actions, gently placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded, as if he understood everything. Miles, face scrunched up with shame, curled up and muttered to himself, clearly at a loss. Unable to keep his composure, Emma stifled a laugh as she addressed Miles. "Trying to impress your daughter? Maybe you should start by listening to what people have to say." Ha ha. Rachel seemed to realize from the situation that Miles had caused trouble by going overboard. With her face turning red and tears welling up, she bowed deeply to us, clearly embarrassed by her father's actions. "I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. My father always tries to show off in front of others, but he always ends up failing like this." As Rachel spoke, clearly embarrassed, we all nodded in understanding. It made sense. If someone like Miles, who never listens and always acts unilaterally, was your father, you'd have your fair share of embarrassing stories. Miles tried to stop his daughter from apologizing, but Rachel glared at him with tear-filled eyes. "I thought I'd finally gotten away from you. You're the worst." With those words, Rachel looked down and began to cry. When we asked for more details, we learned that Rachel had started working at the inn to escape from her father. As much as I had been annoyed by Miles, I couldn't help but feel a little sympathy when I realized that this trip was his desperate attempt to see his daughter, even if only as a guest. Miles, now more dejected than I had ever seen him, collapsed onto the floor, utterly defeated. Feeling a bit sorry for him, I decided to offer a small compliment. "You know, your father just tried a little too hard today. Besides, isn't he supposed to be highly educated and a very capable man?" Rachel looked surprised at my words. But then, as she revealed the truth, we all exchanged bewildered glances, stunned by what she said next. "That's not true. My father's just a show-off. Half of what he says about his education is practically a lie." According to Rachel, while Miles did graduate from a prestigious university, it took him 3 attempts to get in. And even then, he struggled to pass his courses, repeating several years. In fact, it took him over 5 years of repeated failures before he barely managed to graduate. We were all left speechless, our mouths agape, as we learned the truth about Miles's so-called prestigious education that he had been so proud of. Miles had always been a firm believer in academic superiority, constantly belittling me for being a high school dropout. But after learning about his rather unfortunate and wasted 20s, I found myself at a loss for words. Miles, now realizing that his secret was out, covered his face, his ears turning bright red with shame as he curled up even smaller. Shortly after we returned from the company trip, Mr. Yates investigated Miles's past. It turned out that much of Miles's resume was exaggerated, if not outright false. At his previous company, Miles had also championed academic superiority, but in reality, he had advanced by taking credit for others' achievements and presenting them as his own. He repeated this pattern at every job, and at the major manufacturer where he last worked. His brief stint as sales department head was considered a dark chapter in the company's history. His tenure there lasted only about 3 months before his true nature was revealed, and he was swiftly fired. Upon discovering Miles's true nature, Mr. Yates considered firing him, fearing that his presence could harm the company's performance. But out of mercy and hope for his reformation, he decided instead to demote him to a regular employee. No longer a department head, Miles became a pariah, treated as an outcast by his peers. With Miles demoted, my colleagues recommended me for the position, and I was promoted to department head. While I felt embarrassed by the promotion, I also felt a strong sense of responsibility to live up to my team's expectations. As for Miles, now just a regular employee, he continued to carry himself arrogantly but was utterly incompetent. In fact, he was more of a burden than anything, contributing nothing of value to the team. It was shocking how truly incapable he was. As I struggled with how to handle the situation, I thought of Rachel. I decided, as a last-ditch effort, to ask her if Miles had any strengths or hidden talents. What she told me was completely unexpected. "I'm so sorry my father's so useless. But, when it comes to the outdoors, he's surprisingly capable. In fact, he's really good at it." According to Rachel, the reason Miles kept failing in college was his passion for camping. He was such an avid camper that he spent most of the year at campsites, and even now, he still goes out camping from time to time. As a fellow camper, this piqued my interest. At the same time, I remembered a project I had been struggling with for some time. It was a request to find a way to repurpose an abandoned school in a rural area. The plan was to remodel the school into a campsite and lodging facility, but the project had stalled because we couldn't find a suitable manager. That's when I thought of Miles for the role. The following year, the remodeled campsite, built from the old school, was completed. I decided to have Miles work there as the facilities manager. To everyone's surprise, the facility quickly became a hit, with Miles's outdoor workshops becoming especially popular. His extensive knowledge and experience in the outdoors, something he proudly claims to be unmatched, proved true. Miles's survival skills, many of which even I didn't know, became widely talked about for their potential use in disaster relief situations, attracting media attention and even TV interviews. For the first time in his life, Miles, now frequently relied upon by others, was moved to tears, saying he had never felt so valued. Rachel, drawing on her experience as a maid at the inn, also began helping manage the facility alongside her father. While Miles was eager to show his daughter how capable he was, it seemed that Rachel kept a close eye on him to ensure he didn't get carried away. Life is full of surprises, and we never know when or where our past experiences will come in handy. These days, I find myself envying Miles for possessing something beyond academic achievements. As for me, I plan to focus on preserving the nature my grandparents left behind and thinking about what legacy I can pass on to the next generation.